Nobody should have been watching her like that. A worn-down man kneeling in the scorching midday heat, eyes fixed on a young woman sitting with both legs draped over a sun-baked rock. From a distance, it was the kind of scene that could get a man run out of a decent town fast. A dry Wyoming wind scattered dead brush across the open flats outside Laramie, and Cole Hargrove held his position without wavering. His horse stood patient behind him, reins dangling free, ears flicking at the flies circling in the heat. The old barn sat quiet in the background, and the young woman in front of him was shaking from somewhere she couldn't name. She'd been running since well before sunrise, hit the ground hard more than once and nearly stopped fighting. But fear has a peculiar way of pulling a person upright when every muscle has already surrendered. Through wire and brittle brush on bare feet, and by the time she collapsed onto that rock, it wasn't a decision she made. Her legs had simply stopped cooperating. Her dress was torn open across the back, fabric hanging where it had no right to hang. One knee swollen purple and raw, her bare feet coated in pale dust. She tried to pull the cloth tight around herself, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling long enough to manage it. Cole stayed put, gave her space. Let the quiet do the work that words couldn't. He'd seen damage before. The war had given him a complete education in what one human being could do to another, and in what silence could build when decent people chose to look away. But this felt different. Quieter. Cold in a way no fire could reach. She swallowed hard. Her eyes cut toward him once, then snapped away. She wore the expression of someone who had learned to brace for impact around strangers, like whatever came next was simply another thing to survive. Cole peeled off his coat slowly and held it out without closing the distance between them. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and unhurried. "Nothing bad is going to happen to you right now." She hesitated. Then, with a sharp and desperate motion, she turned just far enough for him to see what was along her side and back. The bruises ran deep, layered, old ones buried beneath fresh ones. Her voice barely cleared her throat. "See for yourself." Cole looked, and something inside him shifted. Not improper curiosity. Not fascination. Something closer to recognition. The kind a field surgeon develops and carries like a stone pressed against the sternum for the rest of his life. These weren't the marks of a fall. These were a record, long, deliberate, carefully kept. His jaw tightened. Not from shock, he was long past that, but from the weight of knowing exactly what he was reading. He stepped back, giving her more room, then set the coat on the rock beside her instead of placing it over her shoulders. She pulled it around herself like it was armor. "Who?" Cole asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her lips moved first without sound. Her eyes filled with something beyond pain. It was the kind of fear that had stopped being a visitor and become a permanent resident. Then the name came, barely a whisper. Denton Voss. The hot wind moved through the dry grass. Somewhere distant, a fence post creaked under the pressure. Cole's eyes drifted toward the road, cutting a pale line across the flat land. If that name was real, then nothing about this afternoon was close to finished. He looked back at the young woman on the boulder, still trembling, still holding herself together beneath a stranger's coat, and something stirred in him that he'd buried deep after the war followed him home. A sense of obligation. The kind that won't let you rest, because if what he'd witnessed was real, someone was already coming, and they wouldn't arrive asking politely. The question wasn't whether she was telling the truth. The question was this. When that man showed up to drag her back, would Cole step out of the way like everyone else in her life already had, or would he finally plant himself on the right side of something and refuse to budge? Cole didn't push her. Men who rushed in too fast were usually covering something up. He walked to the well, drew water into a tin cup, and set it down in the space between them. Close enough for her to reach without coming to him, she took it. Both hands locked around it, water spilling down her chin without her noticing. That said plenty. Ruth Calloway came riding in not long after, moving the way she always moved, like the land itself had taught her that patience was the only thing worth having. Her eyes swept across the young woman, then Cole in one clean pass. She didn't waste words on questions that answered themselves. "Inside," she said simply. Cole stayed near the door while Ruth guided the girl into the cool shadow of the barn. He heard low voices for a while.
Then stillness.
Then a single muffled sob that cut itself short. The ones with the most left in them cried fast and then squared up. Ruth came back out a few minutes later, drying her hands on her apron. "It's real bad," she said. Cole didn't ask her to elaborate. He could already fill in what she meant. Ruth dropped her voice. "Wasn't an accident." She paused. "And it wasn't the first time." Cole exhaled through his nose. He'd heard sentences shaped exactly like that one before. Different ground, different names. Same story buried underneath. Inside, the young woman, Clara, which was what she finally offered up, sat curled inside his coat like she was trying to take up less space in the world. Cole crouched near the entrance, far enough back not to crowd her. "You got people somewhere outside this county?" he asked. "Family anywhere else?" She shook her head slowly. "Married," she said. The word landed flat. Like it explained everything and explained nothing at all. Cole sat with it a moment. "Your husband the one who did this?" Another shake. Then the quietest voice he'd heard in years. "He doesn't stop it." That landed harder than a fist would have. Cole leaned back, breathed, then asked again for the name. Denton Voss, he knew it. Anyone who'd spent time within half a day's ride of Laramie knew it. Not the kind of name tied to a reputation worth claiming. The kind people didn't say out loud in mixed company. Ruth crossed her arms. "That whole family's been rotten since before the boy could grow a beard." Clara stared at the floor. "He told me if I left, he'd say I robbed him. Said no one would take my word over his." Cole let a quiet, tired smile cross his face. "Men like that always figure they're the only ones who get to tell the story," he said. He rose to his full height and brushed the dust from his vest. "Let's see how his version holds up in front of the sheriff." Clara looked up fast, alarm breaking across her face. "He'll come after me." Cole glanced out at the long, flat land baking under the afternoon sun. Something shifted at the far edge of the road. "Heat shimmer, maybe. Or maybe not." "Yeah," Cole said plainly. "He will." He rested one hand near his holster. "Not drawing. Just reminding himself it was there. Some stories don't stay buried. They rode in." 3 riders appeared in the distance, moving slow and deliberate. No skulking. No urgency. Just a straight line down that dusty road, like men who expected the world to clear the path ahead of them. They'd followed the trail. Bare footprints in dry dirt don't disappear quickly. Cole stood in the middle of the yard, one hand loose near his gun, the other hanging easy at his side. He didn't call out. Men arriving like this weren't coming for conversation. Behind him, inside the barn, Clara went completely still. Ruth leaned close to her, murmuring something steady and low. Cole kept his eyes on the road. The lead rider came into full view. Tall and angular, sitting that horse like he'd been built on top of it. Denton Voss, no badge, no urgency. An old scar traced one cheekbone, pale and permanent. The kind a man earns in bad circumstances and never once mentions. He wore the expression of someone who had decided long ago that the world owed him deference without question. The other 2 spread out slightly as they closed the distance. Not clever men, but loyal ones. Voss brought his horse to a stop several yards short. Didn't dismount. Didn't need to establish anything else. "You've got property on this land that belongs to my kin," he said. His voice was even. That was the unsettling part. Cole didn't step forward. "Only thing on this land," he said, "is what chose to stay here." Voss produced a thin smile. "Girl's married. I reckon you understand how that works." Cole tilted his head slightly. "Funny thing. Marriage doesn't usually leave marks like the ones I saw." One of the riders behind Voss snorted. Wrong call. Voss didn't turn, but the sound died immediately. Voss leaned forward in the saddle. "You don't have the full picture," he said. Cole nodded once. "You're probably right," he agreed. "So let's ride into town and tell it to someone who can sort it out properly." Something flickered across Voss's face. "Just barely there, but present. No reason to pull the town into a family matter," he said. Inside the barn, a boot shifted on the wood floor. Clara was still listening. Cole moved one slow step sideways, placing himself directly between the riders and the barn door. "Then I'd suggest you turn those horses around," he said, "before this gets considerably louder than you came prepared for." Voss studied him now, taking real stock of him. An older man, hands relaxed, eyes steady, with no fear worth measuring. That troubled him more than a drawn weapon would have. Without a word from Voss, one of the hired men dropped off his horse and moved toward the barn at a quick stride. Cole moved first. Not explosive, precise. He grabbed the handle of a long shovel leaning against the fence post and brought it down in a sharp arc. Caught the man clean across the wrist. Metal on bone. The knife hit the dirt. The second man came in from the right. Cole turned into it, absorbed the blow across his shoulder, then drove his elbow back hard enough to send the man stumbling into the water trough. The pain fired up his arm sharp enough to remind him his body hadn't stayed 20. Water sprayed. The horse sidestepped. Dust billowed. Voss didn't move. He watched. He was the kind of man who spent other people first and only committed himself when the numbers looked right. Then, deliberately and without hurry, he let his hand settle onto the grip of his gun. Cole saw it. He didn't draw his own, because the moment that happened, there was nothing left worth saying. And somewhere just behind him, a young woman was barely breathing, waiting to find out what kind of man Cole Hargrove actually was when things reached the edge. So the question wasn't whether Voss would draw. The question was whether Cole would act first or wait one breath too long. Cole didn't pull iron, not yet. His hand stayed near the gun, but his eyes stayed locked on Voss. Men like Denton Voss were built for exactly this kind of standoff. They needed the other man to flinch first. It justified everything that followed. Cole had watched that game play out across 2 years of war. Young men with fast hands and clean consciences who believed speed made them righteous. It hadn't. It just meant they stopped being wrong a little sooner. Voss let the silence stretch. Then slowly his hand came off the grip. Just an inch. Not retreat. An invitation to believe it was finished. "You're turning a small thing into something it doesn't have to be," he said. Cole let a quiet breath out through his nose. "You're the one who made it this size," he answered. Behind him, Clara shifted again. That small sound said everything. Voss heard it. His eyes tracked toward the barn doorway. And there it was, visible as sunburn. That need to possess. Not land. Not horses. People. "My brother's wife belongs home," Voss said, his voice a degree tighter now. Cole nodded once. "Your brother isn't here," he said. Voss's jaw moved like he was chewing on something he hadn't expected to taste. Cole made his move then. Not a violent one. He stepped back. Deliberate, unhurried. The step of a man making a decision rather than retreating from one. "Here's how this goes," he said. "We all ride to Laramie. You bring your brother. Clara speaks her piece to the sheriff. The law handles what comes next." One of the men on the ground groaned, cradling his wrist. The other stayed put beside the trough, soaked and unwilling to try again. Voss looked at them both, then back at Cole. He didn't like what the numbers said. Not in broad daylight. Not with a witness like Ruth Calloway already standing in the barn doorway with her arms folded and her eyes sharp. "Fine," Voss said finally. The word came out wrong. Not like agreement. Like a man who had simply decided to change the battlefield. Cole caught that. So did Ruth. Clara's grip tightened on the coat around her shoulders, but she said nothing. They moved quickly after that. Horses turned. Dust lifted and rolled behind them. Cole kept Voss in his line of sight the entire way. Men of that breed didn't accept defeat. They simply relocated it. The ride into Laramie was long enough for a fabricated story to find its legs and build momentum. And by the time the main street came into view, something already felt wrong about the air. Too still. Too arranged. Voss didn't look like a man riding into uncertainty anymore. He looked like a man arriving somewhere he'd already arranged. At the sheriff's office, sitting on the bench outside with his hat turning slow circles in his hands and his eyes on the ground, was a man Cole didn't recognize. But Clara did. Her entire body went rigid. Her husband, already there. Already waiting. This hadn't been a chase at all. Voss had never been behind her. He'd been in front of her the whole time, which meant the story already being told inside that office wasn't Clara's story. Someone else had arrived first and planted the version they needed. The question now was the hardest kind. When a lie gets told first in a town where everyone already knows the family name, how do you pull the truth back up before it gets buried alive? The inside of the sheriff's office was close and warm, the kind of room where words stuck to the walls. Eli sat in the corner, eyes down, hands moving restless in his lap. He looked like a man rehearsing lines he no longer fully believed. He glanced once at Voss, then dropped his gaze back to the floor. Clara nearly came undone right there. Not from pain. From watching the truth get crowded out before she'd even had the chance to speak it. Cole didn't raise his voice. Didn't slam anything down on the desk. He'd learned long ago that the loudest man in the room rarely had the most to say. He spoke plainly, cleanly, factually, what he had witnessed when he found her, what condition she was in, what Ruth Calloway had observed and could testify to without hesitation. He laid it down piece by piece like a man building something that needed to hold its own weight. Sheriff Aldridge listened the way a good lawman listens, not for what he wanted to hear, but for what didn't fit. And Eli, sitting there in that corner with years of silence pressing down on him, began to crack. Not all the way. Not clean or easy, but enough. His voice came out rough and fractured when it finally came. And in it was something a fabricated story never carries convincingly: exhaustion. The particular worn-out sound of a man who had grown tired of being afraid of his own family. That was enough to start the unraveling. The rest followed. Inconsistencies. A fire that had been set to burn evidence and instead burned away the lie. Sheriff Aldridge didn't need a signed confession. He had enough to hold Denton Voss. When Voss made one final attempt to reshape the narrative in that room, nobody turned to look at him. By the time the sun touched the tops of the buildings outside, Denton Voss was no longer a free man. And Clara, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, didn't look over her shoulder when she walked through a doorway. Weeks passed, then months. The land stayed unchanged. Same dry heat, same long evenings, same silence that asked nothing of you. But Clara changed inside of it. She stood with more height in her spine. She spoke to people directly, without bracing for impact. She worked alongside Ruth and learned the rhythm of a place that didn't ask her to make herself smaller. And Cole stayed what he had always been: patient, present, never reaching for more than she was ready to offer. One evening, when the sun was bleeding orange across the same stretch of open ground where everything had started, Clara stood beside him and said nothing for a long while. Then quietly, "That day I told you to look. I thought I was showing you something that had been destroyed." Cole gave a small nod. "Now I think," she continued, "I was showing you what was still fighting to survive." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Not many people get a second chance at that," he said. She turned to look at him. Not with fear, not with hesitation, just with the calm and steady eyes of someone who had earned the right to make her own choices. She didn't reach for his hand right away. She just stood there beside him, present and unafraid. And for the first time, that was more than enough. No urgency. No debt owed. Just a choice made freely. And maybe that's the part worth holding. Not who rides in to help, but who stays long enough to let you find your own footing again. Now, I'll be straight with you. Stories like this one don't arrive wrapped up neat and clean. They get gathered, remembered, and shaped sometimes so the truth inside them can be seen through the dust. If this isn't your kind of story, no hard feelings at all. Go rest, take care of yourself, and we'll cross paths some other time. But if it stayed with you, even just for a minute, sit with it a little longer. Tell me where you're listening from.